We're here at the Panasonic European Convention 2016, and I'm joined by Vanja Cernjul, who, among other things, is Director of Photography on the TV series for Netflix, Marco Polo. And we're going to talk about all things HDR. So Vanja, first of all, why as a Director of Photography is HDR so important to you?
Well, HDR is exciting for me because it's basically I like to compare it to extended keyboard that I need to learn how to play. There's so much more room in the highlights, which affects everything. Once you have brighter highlights, you have to treat your midtones differently and your shadows differently. So it's really a new language. It might sound exaggerated, but once you start playing with the highlights and adding more power into the highlights, your whole composition changes. So it's really a new language that I have to learn, and I'm excited about that. It's a challenge.
In the past, how does shooting in SDR affect the way that you shot and mastered content?
Well, you had to keep basically there was always struggle of keeping highlights inside of the to record the highlights, to not lose all your information in the highlights, and then compressing all the information inside that space. So, for example, on my latest show, Marco Polo, it's a 13th century show, and you basically have three light sources. You have sunlight, you have moonlight, and you have fire. So we used all the interiors we used a lot of fire, torches, candles, and a lot of times you had to make a choice whether you let the highlights go and expose for the shadows, or you're going to try to save the information in the highlights in the flames and torches and sacrifice the shadow. Once you know the image is going to be released in HDR, you know that you can save much more information in the highlights, so you can play with the existing light. You can light the whole scenes with fire, for example. We did one scene which was entirely lit just by one torch that the actress was carrying. It was basically literally the only light source in the whole scene. And once I graded that scene in HDR, it was just beautiful how much detail I could still see in the flames, and yet I still saw everything I needed to see in the shadows.
In terms of grading, how do you approach that in terms of the brightness and in terms of when you're doing it compared to an SDR grade, how would you approach an HDR grade?
Well, I still, because it still has to work in SDR, when we shoot we have to be careful not to take it too far so that we sacrifice the SDR version, because most of the audience is going to see it in SDR still. So, but what I'm trying to do is, not when I'm grading, when I'm shooting, I'm trying to always have some light source visible in the frame, whether it's sun, whether it's a flare, a candle, something that later in HDR version I can play with and just add that extra HDR zing to it.
You've recently directed a short film for Panasonic.
Yes.
What was your intention with that?
Well, Panasonic approached me because I was fortunate to work with HDR on my previous project. They approached me and offered me to make this short film so we can further explore HDR. And in the film, I tried to have as many extreme lighting situations as possible. So there were some very dark scenes with very bright light sources, like cars driving at night with headlights shooting directly into the lens. Sun flares, sun directly right in the frame, while still trying to see into the shadows. So we created lighting situations like that, and it was the first time I had a chance to monitor in HDR on the set, which is very important, because then as I said, bright highlights really affect the whole composition. So if you know what the highlights, how bright they are while you're framing the image, it's very helpful. So that was one advantage that I haven't had before, having the HDR monitor on the set. It makes a lot of difference.
Was that a Panasonic monitor that you were using on the set?
Yes, yeah.
Is that the DX902?
It was DX900, yes.
In terms of creativity, is there a possibility that HDR could be abused and perhaps rather than used in a creative way, used to either get people's attention or overused, like in some cases 3D was in the past?
Absolutely, like every technology, it can be abused, and I think it's important that we preserve the original ideas in older features. If they are regraded in HDR, it should be supervised by the filmmakers who created the image originally, or if they are no longer around, we should do research and try to preserve the original ideas rather than destroy them. So, yes, there is a danger if if someone tries to just showcase HDR rather than the original artistry that went into the creation of the image.
If you had the choice between shooting in 4K or HDR, which would you choose?
I would definitely choose HDR. 4K, it's great to have more information in the image, but HDR is something that you can really tell the difference. Average viewer will see the difference immediately, while it may not be the case with 4K.
I was about to ask you, from the point of view of the consumer, what can they expect to get from HDR when they sit down at home and watch HDR content?
I will just tell you how my first experience with HDR was. I was offered to regrade one of the episodes that I previously graded in SDR in Los Angeles. This was more than a year ago. It was probably the only HDR grading suit in LA at the time, and so they have set up the SDR monitor with the SDR grade next to the HDR monitor, so I can refer to it and know what I have already done for SDR. So I started grading in HDR, and I was looking at the HDR screen for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and then I referred back to the SDR screen, and it looked awful. It just looked muddy, the highlights were gray, and I asked the colorist, what's wrong with the image? Something's not right. We have to fix this. And he said, no, this is the SDR image that we worked on for the whole show. So that's how quickly I got used to the HDR highlights, just the clean, beautiful highlights. So I'm sure the audience will have the same experience.
When you were grading in HDR, are you grading to 1000 nits or 4000 nits?
Well, we had a 4000 nits monitor. We rarely went over 1000, and we only, because as I said before, if you're framing having SDR and HDR in mind, you can't push the highlights too far. You have to frame knowing how bright the highlights are, and sometimes if you add too much light in the highlights, the whole composition collapses. So you have to be very careful how you use all that power. So very rarely we went over 1000.
What sort of impact do you think HDR will have on television production in general?
Well, I hope once we learn how to use this, it will add the creative potential of the TV image, and filmmakers will start using it to tell the story and to enhance the drama, and that may just add a new quality to the way that we create content. And it may bring more talent to television, that people who maybe were working only in theatrical features, they now might be interested to start working with this technology. So maybe a little bit too romantic, but I think it may attract more talent.
Vanja, thank you very much.
Thank you.